Hey, this is Joe from Home Studio Corner. There's a lot to remember when it comes to making music. And the last thing you want to do is make a couple of key mistakes right at the very end of the process that completely negates all the hard work you've done up to that point. I'm talking about specifically mistakes people make, and I hear it all the time, when exporting their final mix. So we're going to talk about those mistakes, how to avoid them. And if you haven't checked out my free 5-step mix guide, it is, in my mind, required reading, so go to 5stepmix.com to get your free copy. Okay, let's dive in. Probably the biggest mistake of all is choosing the wrong bit rate when you're exporting an MP3. That can literally ruin everything. Let's listen to it. Here is a good export done at the correct bit rate. And here is one done badly. You can hear it's like this chirpy sound in the high frequencies. Literally, like, you hear those just like, it just gives me goosebumps in a bad way. This is the wrong kind of goosebumps alert. But what's happening here? What is actually going on that causes this to happen? Well, we've chosen two different bit rates. The good one was the highest setting, which is 320 kilobits per second, and the bad one was the lowest setting, which is 64. And if we can learn something by looking at the size column here, check it out. The good one is 4 times bigger than the bad one. So what's happening, MP3 encoding is a way of taking a big wave file that might be 30, 40, 50 megabytes and making it a smaller file. And it does that through some crazy algorithms to try to take away stuff that you hopefully won't hear and only leave stuff that sounds good. To my ear, a 320 kilobit per second MP3 sounds fantastic. But a 64 or even 128 starts to sound pretty crappy, and it's because they have to take out so much information to make it so small that you're just left with crappy sounding audio. Here's what those settings look like in Studio One. You can find them in your system as well. Under MP3, right here, this bit rate is the setting. And if you open yours up and you see that it defaults to something like 64 or even 128, crank that sucker up to 320. Yes, 192 can work, 256 can work. 320 to me sounds the best. I go with that every single time because it gives you a slightly bigger file, but it sounds infinitely better than the smaller one. I can't tell you how many times people have sent me a mix and said, man, in my studio it sounds great, but then I listen in my car and it just sounds completely different and awful and terrible. What plugins do I need to buy? And I look at the file, and you can actually sometimes see by like checking the information on the file itself, you can see what the bit rate is. And I would say at least half the time when they're having this kind of problem, it's just because they exported at the wrong bit rate. Of course it sounds terrible in the car. It sounds terrible here in my studio too. One question you might have is, how does bit rate differ from sample rate? Sample rate is like 44.1 kilohertz. That has to do with how often the audio is measured per second. The bit rate has to do with the actual data encoding on export. They're actually completely different and don't really affect one another. So I'm talking about here, the sample rate to me doesn't really matter that much. The bit rate matters a whole lot. Here's another mistake that I ran into recently with a client. They sent me some tracks to mix, so they sent the multi-tracks in a folder. The only problem was when I went to do the mix, I looked in the folder and they were all MP3 files. Remember, MP3 is about making the file smaller and taking away some quality. It's fine for the final version because we're all typically listening to MP3s on our earbuds anyway, but the rest of the process needs to use higher resolution files so we can actually get the best sounding audio we can. So for mixing, you always want to send your files as the same quality as whatever the session is set to. Meaning send it, I use WAV files, for example. I send tracks off for mixing as full resolution WAV file. So here in Studio One, here's what that looks like. In the Export Stems menu, I can come over here, I select what tracks I want to export, and I can select the format. This is my default 24-bit 44.1. That's what my session is set to almost all the time, and that's what I choose. We have other options here. I can't think of a good reason for exporting MP3 unless it's just you literally have a bandwidth issue, and that's the only way you can get the files to the person. Maybe you're in the middle of, Antarctica and your internet's really slow, so you're just going to have to settle for sending smaller MP3 files. Unless that's you, do the WAV file thing, keep it at the full resolution. The final mistake is super common, but I get it all the time, and it's easy to fix. So someone sends me a song to critique, let's say, and I have the MP3 here, I hit play, and I get ready to listen. Okay, I can see that it's playing, and now I go into troubleshoot mode. I double check to make sure my speakers are on, make sure the fader is pushed up, make sure everything's routed properly, that I haven't missed a button. Why am I not hearing audio? And then eventually, here it comes. There we go. Okay. There is music here. Now, it's normally not that dramatic, but I hundreds of times of doing this over the last decade and a half, where people will send me a song to listen to, and then there's a 5 to 8 second gap at the beginning, and then the music begins. Guess what? That is really disconcerting for the person listening. Whether it's a friend of yours listening to it, or maybe you're doing work for a client, that you send them a mix, and they are so excited to listen, and they press play, probably on their phone, and they hear nothing. And it's playing and they hear nothing. They start to think all kinds of things, like this person doesn't know what they're doing. This person, at best, they know what you did wrong, and they tell you about it. At worst, they assume the worst, and they think, oh man, this person can't even, they sent me a blank audio file. They're probably not going to listen for 19 seconds until the music comes in. They're probably just going to write you back and say, hey, you sent me a blank audio file. What in the world is wrong with you? And now there's this like adversarial relationship, all because you left this huge gap, this big awkward gap at the beginning of the mixdown. It's a really simple problem to solve. So here's what that looks like. If you're in Studio One, whatever system you're in, when you go to whatever window you have for exporting your mixdown, or bouncing to disk, or whatever your system calls it, there's usually an export range section. Mine is called export range, and I choose between the song start and end marker. But we can choose between any kind of marker or between a loop if we want to. The problem is a lot of people forget to set their start marker. So in Studio One, for example, if you don't even have your markers visible, and you go to export this song here, well, I was listening to the click, and I didn't start playing until about bar 14 here. So if I just export it with everything set to the default, we're going to have that huge gap at the beginning. Super awkward and annoying. All we have to do is open up the marker track and drag the start marker to the appropriate place. So something like this. Now, if I export this and hit play, music begins right away. I can't stress to you, it's so simple. It's just a simple little habit that you have to get into your workflow, but make sure you do this every time, at least after you export it, right before you send that email or that text. Hey, listen to this. Just hit spacebar and just play it real quick to make sure that the music begins where you expect it to. And if it doesn't, it's worth the extra 5 minutes to go back in, open it back up, and export it correctly, because otherwise you're leading with the wrong foot forward, right? And it makes everything feel like something's wrong, and that's not what you want. Music production is like building a house. Every idea, every decision builds on the previous one, and you need to have things in place or the rest of the thing falls apart. So I've given you a few more bricks for your arsenal. If you don't currently have an entire system, a blueprint, if you will, for how to go from start to finish through the mixing process, then you need my 5-step mix guide. Download it. Don't take my word for it. Download it, read it, try it on a mix, and you'll find it's incredibly helpful for helping you get through the weeds to the finish line. You can get that at 5stepmix.com. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.